Hi again. Welcome to Meerkat Bouquet. Mexican history is pretty dense. I was supposed to cover a long time ago the 1980s as a decade and how that has impacted the evolution of the corrido, but the 1980s were actually pretty dense, and while doing research, it was just kind of a lot, so I decided to do a different approach where I kind of picked an album from the 80s and then try to see how it fits into the Mexican history and what was going on at the time. So this video is primarily focusing on the 1982 debt crisis in Mexico and all of Latin America, and I'm going to be focusing on the album La Jaula de Oro by Los Tigres del Norte, released in 1984. So let's dive into this history. In the 1970s, Mexico found a lot of oil reserves in the Gulf of Mexico, the Gulf of America.
Oh my god, bro.
Oh, hell no, man. What the fuck, man?
Gulf of Mexico for the rest of the world. This was great because Mexico now had the potential to capitalize on these oil reserves and this oil money. At the time, the oil prices were high, which meant that Mexico could be making a lot of money off of this. At the same time, during the 70s, there was a lot of international commercial banks. I think specifically US banks were letting Mexico and other Latin American countries borrow money at adjustable interest rates. And at the time, a lot of these banks were kind of you're good for it. You got the money. It's okay. Just take the money. It kind of became a problem when lots of these countries were borrowing more than their GDP. At the same time, during the end of the 70s and beginning of the 80s, the US was experiencing some inflation, and to control the inflation, they decided to increase interest rates. So when they increased the interest rates, this put Mexico and a lot of other Latin American countries in trouble, because now the banks were like, we want our money back at this higher rate. And on top of that, during that same time, the price of oil recently dropped because there was less of a demand and more of a supply, which meant that the oil prices were falling. This got Mexico into a lot of trouble, because that's kind of what Mexico is banking on, the price of oil staying high, so then they could still keep making money and be able to pay these high loan payments to international banks. When the price of oil dropped, Mexico declared that they could not pay their oil payments, which at the time were $80 billion. US banks stopped all international borrowing, and this sent both Latin America and Mexico, into a recession. And I have a quote that says, Latin American borrowing from US commercial banks and other creditors increased dramatically during the 1970s. At the end of 1970, total outstanding debt from all sources totaled only $29 billion, but by the end of 1978, that number skyrocketed to $159 billion. By 1982, that debt level reached $327 billion, and this is by the FDIC in 1997. Okay, so a big recession hit Mexico. Recession usually means you got unemployment, and with that, we also see a rise in immigration from Mexico to the United States. So I have a few graphs right here just showing the unemployment rate in Mexico from 1980 to 2030, and you can kind of see that there's a big spike from 1982, 1983, because that's kind of 1982 is when the debt crisis happened. So immediately afterwards in 1983, you see a big, huge spike. We can also see that the Mexican-born population in the United States almost tripled in the 1980s, which can also indicate that there was a rise in Mexican immigration to the United States. And you can see here that from 1970 to 1990, you see that sharp increase. Okay, so that's the quick economic context of what was going on in Mexico in 1982 to 1993. And when I was listening to the album La Jaula de Oro by Los Tigres del Norte in the car, this album was released in 1984. So around the time that the band was probably writing this album, it was probably around 1982, 1983. That's what I presume. So in this album, there are two songs that stuck out to me for their engaging storytelling aspects of the corrido, but also pretty reflective of the history at the time. And the first song that caught my eye was Pedro y Pablo. I think it's like, I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong. I don't know where it is in the album, but it's called Pedro y Pablo. The song tells the story of two brothers, Pedro and Pablo. Pedro is like the oldest and Pablo's the youngest. And the song kind of explains that the two brothers lost their parents. Pedro drops out of school to go to the US and go to work in order to sustain Pablo, who's back in Mexico. And Pedro immediately tells Pablo, it's like, go get an education, follow your dreams. And Pedro also ends up leaving his girlfriend Leticia in Mexico, but tells Leticia, please take care of my little brother, Pablo. So multiple years pass, and Pedro comes back from the US into Mexico, and Pedro and Pablo are now reunited. Pablo is like super proud, and he's like, oh my god, I became a lawyer, I want to show you my house and my wife. And Pedro's like, oh, I'm so happy, yes, I'm so excited to meet your new family. And when they meet the wife ends up being Leticia, which is his former ex-girlfriend.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
And at this, Pablo kind of notices that Pedro gets quiet and he starts getting teary-eyed. And he's like, what's wrong? Like, did I do something wrong? What's wrong? And Pedro kind of lies and is like, oh no, I'm just like proud of you for what you've done. I'm just crying from joy and pride. Even though inside it's kind of implied that he's hurting because he was betrayed by Leticia, not necessarily by his brother. And with that story and the context of what's happening in Mexico, we can kind of understand that Pedro leaves Mexico in order to go to the US, in order to get more economic opportunities and get a job. Because honestly, if there were more economic opportunities at the time, like in 1982, 1983, Pedro wouldn't see it as an option to leave Mexico. But with the context that we know that there was an economic recession in 1982, an increase in immigration, we can kind of understand why Pedro decided to leave Mexico in order to support Pablo in his dreams. And like, this story is sad and the typical like corrido story, but it also begs the question, like, hey, like, how are the brothers both dating the same girl and none of them knew? Like, I'm sorry, but in the 80s, you still could mail letters, you could mail photos. There was landline phones that you could have called. Like, how did this happen? Because, and like, why is Leticia only getting blamed for it? But anyways, let me not get there. Anyways, let's go to the next song. The next song is called La Jaula de Oro. In this song, it recounts the struggles of a man who immigrated to the US with his family when they were like a really young age. So he has like his sons and his wife, and he's kind of like regretting the decision of going to the US because he still longs to go back to Mexico, but his children are kind of like losing Spanish as a language. They're kind of building their life like in the US, and they're detaching and kind of forgetting Mexico. And it's kind of like isolating the man that's regretting moving to the US. The man is sad because although there's like economic opportunities in the US, his heart really longs to go back to Mexico, but he can't go back to Mexico because he can't make a living there at the time. That's what the song is saying. So in the chorus, he said, "What good is money?" It basically in English, he's saying, "What good is money if I'm trapped in the U.S.? Although the cage is made of gold, it is a jail regardless." So in this one, the band also in this song, the band also includes a skit where the dad is talking to his son in Spanish and the son is responding in English. The son is basically saying in English, like, "I have no interest in going back. Like, what are you talking about? Like, I don't want to go back to the US. Why are you bringing up this conversation?" And in the next verse, the main character explains that his children have forgotten their mother tongue, kind of like what I mentioned before, which has affected the family relationship. And the man also describes that his life in the US is isolating because he doesn't go out. He avoids going out because he's afraid of getting deported or getting caught by like law enforcement. I do want to mention, like, for this analysis of the song, that although Los Tigres del Norte was formed in Rosa Morada, Sinaloa, Mexico, the group actually uprooted and moved to San Jose, California, US in the 1960s. So they started recording music in the US, so it kind of makes sense why this whole album is more relatable to like immigrants, and not necessarily like the people that stayed in Mexico during this time. So it kind of makes sense why this album is relatable to those people, but it's also a testament to how like the Mexican economy at the time, like in the 1980s, deeply affected many to move countries in order to find more economic opportunities, financial success, and how also many Mexican families were torn by borders, distance in the 80s as well as in the past, like before the 80s. Also, just in general, I found it kind of cool that Los Tigres del Norte put down roots in San Jose, California, because I myself am from an area nearby. So I was like, oh, I didn't even know that this band that I grew up listening to and my parents like grew up listening to was from like an area that I'm from. Okay. In present time, although the economic conditions in the US are not that great as perhaps they were in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, a lot of themes of this music still resonate very deeply with many generations, particularly my generation, because like I grew up like in the 2000s, in the 90s, and like there was still a lot of immigration that was happening to the US, from Mexico to the US. I myself am Mexican, so I experienced it. And especially with like what's going on with this administration of like persecuting people of Latin American descent and just anybody that looks stereotypically Mexican, and sending them to ICE detention centers such as Alligator Alcatraz. There's a lot of immigrants here that they were moved when they were young and made a life here. And you know, like Mexico in of itself has changed from like what 10, 20, 30 years ago, which like a lot of immigrants that have like moved here have been in the US for long stretches of time, and they made a life here in the US. And like you're kind of stuck in the US, but then if you stay in the US, you're gonna die here and potentially never see your homeland again. And the other option is, okay, you go back to Mexico, and now you haven't been there for like decades, and it's no longer the Mexico that you knew back then. And like, if you go back to Mexico, you gotta cross the border back, like if you want to go back to the US and see your loved ones. And it's just like, I think like the song La Jaula de Oro really encapsulates like how immigrants really feel trapped by their circumstances and immigration status. So yeah, I didn't write a conclusion for this song, for this video. But yeah, I just thought like it was interesting that even though these themes were showing up in the 80s, like they're still pretty relevant right now in 2025, present day. So yeah, and I think it also goes to show like why Los Tigres del Norte are still like very relevant and legendary artists in of itself. Like they still go on tour and like they still have a lot of fans. So it's interesting how like even though they're very old, they've touched many generations. So that's it for the 1980s. I know I only covered 1982 debt crisis in Mexico, and Los Tigres del Norte, but I just wanted to make a quick video in order to not like bore you guys and also like just keep making videos for my channel. Thank you for listening to me blab about corridos and history. I hope you have a great day and you listen to great music. Feel free to like this video, subscribe. Thanks a lot, and bye.